$10 million was the exact price tag Carter had just announced he won for marrying me. I stood frozen behind the heavy, solid oak double doors of the library. My hand gripped the cold brass handle so hard my knuckles turned white, while I listened to my husband call his wife a discount item from the clearance bin. The raucous laughter erupting from the library sounded like shattering glass slicing through my eardrums. Carter was sitting in there, lounging on his imported Italian leather armchair like a king on a throne. He held a crystal tumbler of scotch in one hand and boasted about his conquest to his wolf pack. He told them that making me fall in love with him was easier than tricking a toddler. He bragged that the $10 million bet from his friends was the highest return on investment he had ever made in his life. The blood in my veins began to boil. It rushed to my brain and made my temples throb with a violent rhythm. I wanted to burst into that room. I wanted to flip the heavy mahogany table and tear that smug look right off his handsome face. But the moment my fingers tightened on the handle, the cold logic of a professional gambler pulled me back from the edge. I could not let raw emotion ruin a hand this important. The prenuptial agreement flashed in my mind as clearly as a neon danger sign on a highway. Clause 4, Section 2 stated explicitly that if I was the one to initiate hostility or file for divorce first, I would walk away with absolutely nothing. I would also have to pay damages for defamation to his prestigious family name. That was the lock he had slipped onto my finger along with this 10-carat diamond ring. I took a deep, sharp breath. I forced my erratic heartbeat to slow down to the calculated rhythm of a predator. I released the door handle. I turned on my heel and walked softly back toward the master bedroom. If he wanted to turn this marriage into a high-stakes wager, I would show him what it meant to lose everything. I needed a new suit of armor. Not for defense, but to strike at the fatal weakness of every arrogant man in this zip code. The floor-to-ceiling mirror in the walk-in closet reflected a woman who looked too fragile. So I shattered that image immediately. 10 minutes later, I was no longer Elena the trophy wife. I was the dealer. I slid my body into a crimson Versace silk dress that Carter had always forbidden me to wear because it was too provocative. I applied lipstick the shade of fresh arterial blood. The reflection in the mirror was now a huntress camouflaged under a layer of luxury. I walked down the spiral staircase. The sound of my stilettos clicking on the marble floor echoed like a countdown timer. I pushed open the library doors with force. The laughter inside died instantly. 5 pairs of eyes went wide. They stared at me in stunned silence. Carter was the first to recover. He hastily adjusted his tie and put on his mask of fake affection. He stood up and walked toward me. He leaned in to place a kiss on my cheek. But I tilted my head slightly. I let his lips brush against the cold air. I swept my gaze over the wolf pack with eyes that feigned total innocence. I asked if I was interrupting their gentleman's evening. I played the role of the perfect hostess. I poured 50-year-old single malt scotch into crystal glasses for each of them with my own hands. I moved around the room. I let the scent of my expensive perfume suffocate the guilt rising in their chests. I leaned in close to Liam, the weakest link in the chain. I whispered that he looked tired tonight. Carter watched us. His knuckles turned white as he gripped his glass. This was the first bait. Male possessiveness is the easiest string to pull. I walked back to the marble bar counter and deliberately brushed my hand to knock my phone onto the surface. It landed face up. The screen lit up brightly with a notification I had scheduled 5 minutes ago. A text message from an unknown number appeared clearly for anyone to see. "You look ravishing tonight. I cannot wait any longer." Carter saw it. His eyes went dark instantly. A jealous rage flared up like gasoline meeting an open flame. He snatched the phone before I could reach for it. He read the text over and over again. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. It felt like lead. He shoved the phone into my face. He growled and asked who had the audacity to text me at midnight. I looked at him calmly. I slowly took the phone back with an expression of terrifying composure. I told him it was just a wrong number. A simple coincidence. Carter scoffed. His laugh was cold and full of disdain. He turned to his friends. He pointed a finger at my face as if I were a defective product he wanted to return. He announced loudly that no matter how much money he draped over my body, I was still just a girl from the gutter that he had pitied and picked up. The insult hung in the air. It stabbed straight into my pride. But I did not blink. I did not cry. I stood there. I recorded every single word into my memory to give to my lawyer. This was the first violation of his moral clause. I had triggered him to reveal his true face, before witnesses, without saying a single malicious word myself. The wolf pack sensed the dangerous tension and began to make excuses to leave. Liam looked back at me with a gaze that mixed pity with filthy desire. When the front door closed, Carter stripped off his aristocratic mask completely. He pulled a thick stack of cash from his suit pocket. The rubber band snapped. He threw the money directly at me. The bills fluttered through the air like dead leaves. They landed on the expensive Persian rug. He gritted his teeth and told me to take the money and go shopping. He told me to keep my mouth shut about tonight. He thought money could buy my silence and my dignity. I looked at the bills scattered at my feet. Then I looked up at his face, which was flushed red with alcohol. I did not bend down to pick up a single bill. I stepped over the pile of money. My sharp stiletto heel crushed the face of Benjamin Franklin on a $100 bill. I paused at the doorway. I looked back at him over my bare shoulder. I spoke to him in a voice colder than liquid nitrogen. I told him he should keep that money, because he was going to need every single cent to pay for my alimony very soon. I left him standing there in shock and rage. I walked straight to my room and locked the door. I leaned my back against the heavy wood. I listened to the sound of Carter smashing glass downstairs. He thought he had won this hand because he held the king. But he forgot one basic rule. I was the one dealing the cards. I pulled a burner phone hidden inside a hollowed-out lipstick tube. My hands were no longer shaking. They were steady. I dialed a number I had not called in 3 years. The line connected on the first ring. A deep voice on the other end asked if I was in trouble. I looked at my sharp reflection in the dark window glass. I replied that I was not in trouble. I told him I was starting a new game. I told him I needed to liquidate some assets and trigger some legal clauses. The war had officially begun. And Carter had no idea he had been checkmated from the very first move. The neon sign of the underground jazz bar buzzed with a low electrical hum that matched the vibration of anxiety in my chest. I sat in the darkest booth at the back of the Blind Tiger. Across from me sat Marcus. He was the only lawyer in New York who had been disbarred twice and still managed to win cases that terrified the Supreme Court. He slid the heavy document across the scratched wooden table. His finger tapped on a paragraph highlighted in yellow marker. He told me that this was the loophole. Clause 17, Section B. It was the moral clause. Carter had been so arrogant when he drafted this prenuptial agreement that he included a standard clause to protect his family reputation. It stated that if either party engaged in public conduct that resulted in significant reputational damage or loss of stock value for the family holding company, the injured party would be entitled to 50% of the marital assets as compensation. Marcus looked at me with his shark-like eyes. He said that I needed to make him lose his mind in public. I needed him to be the one to break the rules while the world watched. I nodded slowly. I picked up the glass of water and took a sip. My plan was not just to irritate him. It was to drag his carefully constructed persona into the mud. I needed to spend his money. But not on clothes or jewelry that he could reclaim. I needed to spend it on something he could not take back. I needed to destroy his liquidity while building my own saintly image. I walked out of the bar and straight into the bright sunlight of Fifth Avenue. My phone was still connected to Carter's primary black card. He had not canceled it yet because he wanted to track my movements. He wanted to see me buy a sad consolation prize so he could mock me later. I would not give him that satisfaction. I walked into the most prestigious antique auction house in the city. The curator greeted me with a fake smile. I told him I wanted to make a donation in my husband's name to the city's orphanage for underprivileged children. I pointed to a hideous abstract sculpture that had been collecting dust in their inventory for years. It was listed at $400,000. I told them to wrap it up and send it to the orphanage with a plaque that read "Gifted by Carter Vander Woodson." I swiped the card. The machine beeped approval. I did not stop there. I went to a high-end pet store and bought 50 purebred poodles. I arranged for them to be delivered to the local animal shelter with a donation of $50,000 for their care. All under Carter's name. I was bleeding his accounts dry. But I was doing it in a way that if he tried to reverse the charges, the press would headline that the billionaire hates orphans and puppies. I was weaponizing his own wealth against his public image. My phone began to vibrate violently in my purse around 2 p.m. It was not a text message this time. It was a call from Carter. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. Then it rang again immediately. I stood in the middle of a luxury car dealership. I was about to put a down payment on a fleet of electric buses for the city school district. Suddenly, the sales manager looked at me with an awkward expression. He whispered that the card had been declined. Carter had finally realized what was happening and pulled the plug. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction. This was exactly the reaction I wanted. I looked at the manager with wide, innocent eyes. I asked him loudly enough for the other customers to hear if my husband was bankrupt. I pulled out my own small credit card to pay for a taxi, leaving the dealership in a buzz of rumors. I knew that within the hour, whispers about Carter's liquidity problems would reach Wall Street. I took a cab back to the penthouse. The real game was about to be played on home turf. I walked into the silent house. It felt like the calm before a hurricane. I went straight to the master bedroom. Carter had cut off my access to his money, so I had to create my own liquidity. I walked into his walk-in closet. The scent of cedar and expensive cologne filled the air. I went to the wall safe hidden behind a painting of a ship in a storm. I knew the combination because I had watched him punch it in through the reflection of a wine glass 3 months ago. The heavy steel door of the safe clicked open with a satisfying sound. Inside sat his pride and joy. The Patek Philippe watch collection. There were 12 watches in total. Each one was worth more than a house in the suburbs. He loved these watches more than he had ever loved me. I took them out one by one. I lined them up on the velvet bench. I pulled out my phone and opened an anonymous seller account on an auction site. I took photos of each watch. I listed them with a starting bid of $1. The title of the listing was "Cheating Husband Sale." I hit the publish button. Within seconds, the notification started pinging like a slot machine hitting the jackpot. Bids were flying in. 10,000. 20,000. 50,000. I was selling millions of dollars of inventory for pennies on the dollar. I was not doing this for the money. I was doing it to incinerate his ego. When the first watch sold for a fraction of its value, I felt a dopamine hit stronger than any drug. I packed the watches into a cardboard box and labeled it for shipping. Then I went downstairs to the kitchen. I set up my tripod on the kitchen island, hiding it cleverly behind a large rack of imported spices. I adjusted the angle so it covered the entire kitchen floor. I pressed the record button. The tiny red light blinked once, and then vanished. Now all I had to do was wait for the monster to come home. The front door slammed open with such force that the walls of the house seemed to shake. Heavy footsteps stomped across the marble floor, shouting my name with a guttural rage. Carter had received the email notifications from the auction site. He stormed into the kitchen. His face was a mask of pure fury, veins bulging in his neck like thick cords. He looked around wildly until his eyes landed on the empty velvet watch box I had left on the counter as a provocation. He lunged at me, grabbing my upper arms with a grip that I knew would leave bruises by tomorrow morning. He shook me violently, screaming and asking where his collection was. I let my body go limp, playing the role of the terrified victim perfectly. I looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, begging him to calm down. I told him I had to sell them to pay for the donations he promised. He raised his hand, his palm open and ready to strike. The air in the room grew thick with the threat of violence. This was the moment. The tipping point. If he hit me, I would win the jackpot. But if he stopped, I would still have the footage of his aggression. I did not flinch away from his raised hand. Instead, I stepped closer to him, looking him dead in the eye. I lowered my voice to a whisper that was colder than the deepest ocean. I dared him to do it. I told him to go ahead and strike me so he could feel like a big man. Carter paused, his hand hovering in the air, trembling with the effort to restrain himself. He was breathing heavily, his eyes darting around my face, searching for fear, but finding only defiance. I slowly lifted my finger and pointed over his shoulder toward the spice rack, toward the tiny lens of the camera that had been recording everything in high definition. I told him to say hello to his shareholders and his mother. Carter froze. The color drained from his face instantly, turning from angry red to a sickly pale gray. He looked at the camera, then back at me, horror dawning in his eyes. He realized he had almost just destroyed his entire life on a live stream. He released my arms as if I were on fire. Stumbling back a few steps, I smoothed out the wrinkles on my silk blouse, staring at him with a look of absolute victory. I told him that from this moment on, the rules of this house had changed. I told him that every time he raised his voice, I would sell a car. Every time he threatened me, I would donate a building. And if he ever touched me again, I would release the director's cut of this video to the board of directors. Carter stood there, panting like a trapped animal. He looked at the empty watch box, then at me, and for the first time in our marriage, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He turned around and stormed out of the kitchen without saying a word, retreating to his study like a wounded dog. I walked over to the camera and stopped the recording. I saved the file to 3 different cloud servers. I looked at the timestamp. It was only 6 in the evening. The night was still young, and I had so many more games left to play. The midday sun beat down on the manicured green perfection of the Hampton Hills Country Club. I adjusted my oversized sunglasses and stepped out of the white golf cart. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and old money. This was the hunting ground of the wolf pack. Carter was locked in his study back home, frantically trying to liquidate assets that I had already frozen. So he had sent his regrets to the weekly golf game. That left a power vacuum that I intended to fill with poison. I spotted them on the putting green of the 9th hole, Liam, Mason, and Noah. They stood in a tight circle wearing pastel polo shirts and laughing about insider trading like it was a spectator sport. I smoothed down my white tennis skirt, checked my reflection in the side mirror of the cart, and put on the mask of the worried, confused wife. I did not come here to play golf. I came here to sever the limbs of the beast. I walked across the grass, my sneakers making no sound. I approached them from behind just as Liam lined up a putt. Liam missed the shot when he saw me. The ball rolled inches past the hole. He looked up, surprised to see me there without his leader. I offered a shy, apologetic smile. I told them that Carter could not make it today because he was dealing with some unexpected auditors at the house. The word auditors hung in the air like a foul smell. Mason lowered his driver, his eyes narrowing instantly. He asked what kind of auditors. I feigned ignorance, twisting the diamond ring on my finger nervously. I told them I did not understand the technical terms, but I heard Carter mention something about the Securities and Exchange Commission and an immunity deal for whoever cooperates first. The color drained from Mason's face. In their world, the SEC was the Grim Reaper, and immunity meant someone was snitching to save their own skin. I saw the seed of doubt take root in their eyes instantly. They exchanged glanced that were no longer friendly, paranoia spreading among them like a virus. I accepted a glass of iced tea from a passing waiter and took a sip, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. I looked at Noah, the most risk-averse of the group, and asked innocently if Carter had mentioned transferring the joint investment funds to the Cayman Islands account yet. Noah dropped his golf glove. He stared at me with wide eyes. He stuttered that there was no Cayman account for the joint fund. I covered my mouth with my hand in a gesture of fake shock. I apologized profusely, saying I must have misheard and that I should not have said anything. I begged them not to tell Carter I spoke about his exit strategy. The trap snapped shut. By trying to cover up my mistake, I had convinced them that Carter was embezzling their money and planning to flee the country while leaving them to face the federal investigation. Mason pulled out his phone immediately, walking away to make a frantic call to his private banker. Noah was already texting furiously, his thumbs blurring on the screen. Only Liam remained, watching me with a calculating gaze. He was the youngest and the hungriest of the pack. He stepped closer to me, invading my personal space under the pretense of retrieving his golf ball. He lowered his voice, asking if Carter was really selling them out. I looked up at him, letting my lower lip tremble slightly. I told him that Carter said everyone has a price, and that $10 million was just the buy-in fee. Liam clenched his jaw. He knew exactly what that number meant. It was the amount of the bet they made on our marriage. He realized that if Carter was willing to gamble on a human life, he was certainly willing to gamble with their money. Liam leaned in closer, the smell of expensive cologne and fear radiating from him. He told me that he was not going down for Carter. He said that if the ship was sinking, he wanted a life raft. I looked him dead in the eye, dropping the act of the naive wife for a split second. I told him that I was the captain of the lifeboat, but a seat on it would cost him. I needed proof of Carter's tax evasions from the last fiscal year, the ones they had all laughed about at the Christmas party. Liam hesitated, looking at his friends who were now pacing around the green in panic. He reached into his golf bag, pretending to look for a tee. He pulled out a silver USB drive attached to his keychain. He pressed it into my hand, his fingers lingering on my palm. He whispered that everything was on there. including the offshore shell companies. He looked at me with a mix of fear and admiration, realizing perhaps for the first time that I was not the prey. I closed my fingers around the cold metal of the flash drive. It felt heavier than gold. I slipped it into the pocket of my skirt. I stepped back and gave Liam a dazzling smile, thanking him for the golf tip. I turned and walked back toward the clubhouse, leaving the wolf pack in total disarray behind me. Mason was shouting into his phone. Noah looked like he was about to vomit. And Liam was watching me walk away as if I were a goddess of destruction. I had not just isolated Carter. I had turned his brothers into his executioners. I sat down in the leather seat of the golf cart and drove away. The wind blew through my hair, carrying the sound of their fracturing alliance. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Carter demanding to know where I was. I ignored it. I had a date with a forensic accountant to decode the data on this drive. The bet was $10 million. But the payout was going to be priceless. I walked into the penthouse to the sound of Carter screaming at his iPhone. He was pacing the living room floor like a caged tiger. Veins bulged on his forehead as he yelled at Mason to listen to reason. He smashed the end call button and threw the phone onto the imported Italian sofa. He looked at me with wild eyes, asking where I had been. I held up a shopping bag from a local grocery store. I told him I just went to get him some comfort food because he sounded stressed on the phone. He slumped onto the couch, running his hands through his messy hair. He muttered that his friends had gone crazy, accusing him of stealing their money and talking to the feds. I sat next to him, placing a comforting hand on his knee. I whispered that maybe they were just jealous of his success. I played the role of the supportive wife perfectly, while the heavy USB drive in my pocket pressed against my thigh like a loaded gun. I excused myself to the kitchen to make him some chamomile tea. I set the kettle to boil. The whistling sound masked the noise of me pulling out my burner phone. I accessed the encrypted email service I had set up with Marcus. I attached a single PDF file from Liam's USB drive. It was a bank statement from a shell company in the Cayman Islands named Blue Horizon Ventures. I typed a short subject line. I know what you did last summer. I hit send. I walked back into the living room with the steaming mug. I watched him pick up his iPad. The notification chimed softly. He swiped the screen. His face went pale instantly. He dropped the iPad on the rug. He looked around the room frantically, paranoia seizing his chest. He stammered that someone hacked him. Someone knew about Blue Horizon. I looked at him with wide, innocent eyes, asking him what Blue Horizon was. He snapped at me to shut up, telling me it was business I was too stupid to understand. Carter ran to his study to check his private servers. I used those few minutes to execute the next phase of the psychological torture. I opened his briefcase, which he had carelessly left on the foyer table. I slipped in 2 first-class tickets to Paris, printed with his name and the name of his ex-girlfriend, whom he swore he had not seen in 5 years. I also placed a brochure for a non-extradition country right on top of his important files. I zipped the bag shut and returned to the couch, taking a sip of my tea. Carter came storming back out, holding a stack of papers. He grabbed his briefcase to pack them. He opened the leather flap and froze. He pulled out the tickets, staring at them in total confusion. He whispered to himself, asking where these came from. He looked at me, suspicion flickering in his eyes. But I was just sitting there reading a magazine, looking completely unbothered. He started to doubt his own memory, wondering if he had bought them in a drunken blackout. He frantically dialed the number of his ex-girlfriend, desperate for an explanation. But the line went straight to voicemail because I had blocked her number on his phone while he was in the shower this morning. He threw the phone against the wall, cracking the screen. He screamed that everyone was setting him up. He paced around the room, muttering that Mason must have planted the tickets. Or maybe Liam was trying to frame him. He was spiraling into a paranoia-induced breakdown. I stood up slowly. I walked over to him and picked up the broken phone. I told him softly that he seemed unwell. I suggested that maybe he needed to rest, or perhaps see a doctor. I used the specific tone of voice one uses with a mentally unstable patient. Carter looked at me, his eyes bloodshot. He pointed a shaking finger at me, telling me to stop looking at him like he was crazy. But the fear in his voice betrayed him. He was starting to believe that maybe he was actually losing his mind. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the apartment. Carter went to the main control panel on the wall. He engaged the maximum security lockdown protocol. Steel shutters descended over the panoramic windows with a heavy mechanical grinding sound. He double-locked the front door and punched in a new code that only he knew. He turned to me with a manic grin. He told me that no one was getting in and no one was getting out until he figured out who the traitor was. He disconnected the landline phone and put it in his pocket. He was unknowingly handing me the final weapon I needed. False imprisonment. I shrank back into the sofa, pretending to be terrified. But inside, I was celebrating. He had just turned our home into a prison cell, and he had thrown away the key. This was exactly what the law required to prove he was a danger to my safety. Carter went into the kitchen to pour himself another drink, his hands shaking so much the bottle clattered against the glass. I slipped my hand under the cushion of the sofa where I had taped the burner phone earlier. I texted Marcus 3 words. Initiate Protocol 0. This was the signal to call the police and report a domestic disturbance with a possible hostage situation. I looked at Carter's back as he downed the amber liquid. He thought he was protecting himself from his enemies. He did not realize that the enemy was sitting right behind him, quietly knitting a scarf. The stage was set for his public execution, and he had just locked himself in the cage. Blue and red strobe lights began to slice through the gaps in the steel security shutters. They painted the living room in a chaotic rhythm of violence and authority. A megaphone voice boomed from the street below, commanding the occupants to open the door immediately. Carter stopped his pacing. He stared at the window with the confusion of a man waking up from a nightmare. He gripped the neck of his whiskey bottle tightly. He turned to me and hissed that it was a trick. He believed the wolf pack had hired actors to scare him out of his fortress. He stumbled toward the intercom panel on the wall. He pressed the talk button and screamed that he knew who sent them. He yelled that he was armed and would not hesitate to defend his property. He had just turned a welfare check into an armed standoff. I huddled in the corner of the sofa, burying my face in my hands to hide the smile that was threatening to break through. I heard the heavy thud of a battering ram hitting the reinforced front door. The metal groaned under the impact. Carter backed away, his face draining of color as reality began to crash through his delusion. The front door exploded inward with a deafening crash that shook the floorboards. Wood splinters and metal shards flew across the foyer like shrapnel. A team of tactical officers swarmed into the penthouse, their weapons raised and flashlights blinding. They shouted conflicting commands, telling us to get on the ground and show our hands. Carter reacted with the arrogance of a man who had never faced consequences. He stepped forward, raising the bottle in a threatening gesture. He demanded to speak to the police commissioner immediately. 2 officers tackled him before he could finish his sentence. They slammed him face first onto the expensive Persian rug. The sound of air leaving his lungs was audible. I let out a calculated scream of terror. I crawled toward the nearest officer. Raising my trembling hands, I begged them not to hurt him. Acting the part of the devoted but terrified wife. The officer helped me up gently, shielding my body with his own, while his partners handcuffed Carter. They dragged Carter out of the apartment. He was kicking and screaming about lawsuits and his constitutional rights. His expensive Italian suit was rumpled and covered in dust. His hair was a wild mess, and the smell of expensive scotch wafted off him in waves. I followed them, wrapped in a thick gray blanket that an officer had draped over my shoulders. We rode the elevator down in a tense silence. Carter glared at me with bloodshot eyes, muttering that I had set him up. I looked away, wiping a fake tear from my cheek. The elevator doors opened to the lobby, and the flash of 100 camera bulbs blinded us instantly. Marcus had done his job perfectly. The press was waiting, hungry for the fall of a titan. Reporters shoved microphones past the police cordon, shouting questions about domestic abuse and financial fraud. Carter tried to straighten his back, attempting to regain some shred of dignity. But he only looked more like a deranged lunatic. Carter lunged toward a camera, shouting that this was all a misunderstanding. He yelled that he was the victim of a conspiracy. The police shoved him firmly into the back of a waiting squad car, slamming the door on his protests. The image of billionaire Carter Vander Woodson, drunk and handcuffed, flashed across every news network in the country within minutes. I stood on the sidewalk, the wind biting at my bare arms. I looked like the perfect tragic heroine. A reporter thrust a microphone in my face, asking if I felt safe now. I looked directly into the camera lens. I whispered that I just wanted my husband to get the help he needed. I knew Carter was watching this from the back of the cruiser. I knew he was seeing his stock price plummet with every word I spoke. The public humiliation was complete. His reputation was shattered. And according to the prenuptial agreement, that meant his assets were now vulnerable. 3 hours later, the chaos had subsided. I sat in the quiet of the penthouse, sipping a glass of water. The phone rang. It was Carter's private attorney. He informed me that Carter had posted an astronomical bail and was being released. He relayed a message from Carter. It was not an apology. It was an order. Carter demanded that I attend the grand charity gala tomorrow night with him. He wanted to present a united front to the media to salvage what was left of his image. He threatened that if I did not show up and play the loving wife, he would burn the house down with me inside. I smiled at the phone. It was exactly what I had hoped for. He was desperate. He was inviting me onto a public stage to save him. He did not realize he was inviting his executioner to the scaffold. I told the lawyer to tell Carter I would be there. I hung up the phone. I walked to the closet and pulled out the dress I had been saving for the finale. It was time for the counterbet. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel shimmered with the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers and the flash of paparazzi cameras. I walked down the grand staircase with my arm linked through Carter's. His grip on my bicep was tight enough to cut off circulation. He was smiling at the crowd, waving like a beloved monarch returning from exile. He whispered through his gritted teeth that if I messed this up, he would ruin me. I wore a backless emerald green gown that cost more than a luxury sedan. It was the color of money, the only language these people understood. I smiled back at him, patting his hand gently while digging my nails into his skin. I told him to relax and enjoy the show because it was going to be a night to remember. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and hypocrisy. The elite of New York society had gathered to watch the spectacle. They whispered behind their champagne flutes, betting on whether our marriage would survive the week. I looked out at the sea of faces and spotted the wolf pack huddled near the bar. They looked nervous, glancing at Carter with suspicion. The seeds of discord I had planted were blooming beautifully. Carter led me onto the main stage. The spotlight blinded us for a second. The room fell silent as he tapped the microphone. He launched into a rehearsed speech about love and forgiveness. He claimed his arrest was a misunderstanding caused by exhaustion and medication. He painted himself as a victim of his own hard work. He turned to me with moist eyes, asking his beloved wife to say a few words about his character. This was the moment he had scripted. He expected me to cry and defend him. I took the microphone from his hand. The metal was cold against my skin. I looked at him, then at the wolf pack, then at the silent crowd. I leaned into the mic, my voice steady and clear. I said that my husband was right about one thing. He was a man of great passion, especially when it came to gambling. I signaled the sound technician in the back of the room, a young man I had bribed with $5,000 an hour ago. He pressed play. A crackle of static burst through the massive speakers, followed by a voice that was unmistakably Carter's. It was the recording from the night of our anniversary. His voice boomed across the ballroom, bragging about the $10 million bet he had made with his friends. He called me a discount item, a trophy he had bought cheaply. He laughed about how easy it was to manipulate a poor girl. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of everyone's lungs. Carter froze. His face went white as a sheet. He looked at the speakers in horror, then turned to me with murder in his eyes. The recording continued, playing the voices of Liam, Mason, and Noah laughing and congratulating him on the con. The wolf pack dropped their glasses. The sound of shattering crystal echoed like gunshots. Carter lunged at me, his hands reaching for my throat to stop the truth. But I had anticipated this. I sidestepped with the grace of a matador. Carter's momentum carried him forward. He stumbled past me, his expensive dress shoes slipping on the polished floor. He crashed headfirst into the tiered champagne fountain behind me. Hundreds of glasses collapsed in a waterfall of broken glass and sticky liquid. He lay there, drenched in champagne, groaning in pain amidst the wreckage of his own dignity. The crowd gasped in unison. Camera flashes erupted like a strobe light storm, capturing every second of his humiliation. I stood over him, holding the microphone like a scepter. I looked down at the man who thought he owned me. I spoke calmly into the mic, addressing the entire room. I announced that since my husband enjoyed betting so much, I wanted to propose a counter bet. I pointed a finger at the terrified wolf pack near the bar. I asked who among them wanted to be the first to turn over the evidence of Carter's embezzlement in exchange for immunity. The tension in the room snapped. The wolf pack looked at each other, panic overriding their loyalty. Liam was the first to break. He shouted from the back of the room that he had the files. He yelled that Carter forced him to sign the fraudulent documents. Mason screamed that he was a witness. They began to turn on each other like starving dogs fighting for a bone. Carter struggled to sit up, wiping champagne from his eyes. He roared at them to shut up, threatening to kill them all. but his voice was drowned out by the chaos he had created. Security guards rushed the stage, not to protect him, but to restrain him as he tried to attack his friends. I stood in the center of the storm, untouched and serene. I had turned his social circle into a firing squad, and he was the one standing against the wall. I walked down the stairs of the stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. No one dared to touch me. They looked at me with a mix of fear and awe. I stopped in front of a stunned police commissioner who was attending the gala. I pulled the USB drive from my clutch, the one Liam had given me on the golf course. I pressed it into his hand. I told him that I believed this belonged to the evidence locker. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back, leaving Carter screaming my name as he was handcuffed for the second time in 24 hours. The cool night air hit my face. It tasted like freedom. And $50 million. The fluorescent lights of the police interrogation room hummed with a headache-inducing frequency that matched the throbbing vein in Carter's temple. He sat on the other side of the metal table, handcuffed to the chair rail. His tuxedo shirt was torn at the collar and stained with dried champagne, which smelled sour in the small, windowless room. I walked in wearing a pristine white suit that cost more than the bail bond he could not afford to post. Marcus followed me carrying a thick leather briefcase. He set it down on the table with a heavy thud that sounded like a coffin lid closing. Carter looked up at me. His eyes were bloodshot and rimmed with dark circles of exhaustion. He tried to sneer, attempting to summon his usual arrogance, but it came out as a pathetic grimace. He spat out that I had had my fun and now I should call his father to get him out of this mess. I pulled out the metal chair opposite him and sat down slowly, crossing my legs with deliberate elegance. I told him that his father was currently busy holding a press conference to announce that he had severed all ties with his disgraced son to save the family stock price. Carter flinched as if I had slapped him. The realization that his safety net was gone began to crack his composure. Marcus opened the briefcase and slid a stack of documents across the cold steel table. The first page was titled Transfer of Assets. I tapped my manicured fingernail on the header. I explained to him in a calm voice that according to Clause 17 of our prenuptial agreement, his public display of aggression at the gala, combined with the video evidence of his betting ring, constituted a severe breach of the moral clause. This triggered an immediate penalty. 50% of his total net worth was automatically transferred to me as compensation for reputational damage. Carter laughed. A dry, raspy sound that echoed off the concrete walls. He leaned forward, straining against the handcuffs. He hissed that 50% of $1 billion still left him with enough money to crush me. He said he would hire the best lawyers in the country and tie this up in court for decades until I starved. He was still clinging to the illusion of his power, not realizing that I had not just come for half. I had come for everything. I signaled Marcus to slide the second document forward. This one was a notice of default from the First National Bank. I watched Carter's eyes scan the paper. Confusion turning into panic. I explained the financial mechanics to him as if he were a slow child. I told him that his entire lifestyle was funded by loans secured against his company stock. When I released the evidence of his fraud last night, the stock price crashed by 60% in pre-market trading. That triggered a margin call. The bank demanded immediate repayment of $200 million in cash, which he did not have because I had drained his liquid accounts for charity. Carter went pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He whispered that the bank would give him an extension, that they always did. I shook my head slowly. A predator smiling at its prey. I told him that usually they would. But this morning at 9 o'clock, a private equity firm bought his distressed debt from the bank at a discount. I leaned across the table. invading his personal space until I could see the fear dilating his pupils. I whispered the punchline of my joke. I told him that I was the sole owner of that private equity firm. I bought his debt, Carter. I am not just your wife anymore. I am your creditor. And I am calling in the loan right now. Carter slumped back in his chair, the breath leaving his body in a defeated wheeze. He looked at the documents, then at me. Realizing the trap had snapped shut hours ago, I offered him a pen. A cheap plastic ballpoint that looked ridiculous next to the legal documents. I gave him a choice. He could sign the asset transfer, assigning the remaining 50% of his wealth to me to satisfy the debt. Or I would foreclose on everything he had left, including his family estate in the Hamptons, and leave him in this cell to face the federal fraud charges without a penny to pay for a lawyer. Carter looked at the pen as if it were a poisonous snake. His hands shook violently as he reached for it. The scratching sound of the pen on paper was the only noise in the room. It was the sound of an empire crumbling. He signed page after page, giving away his houses, his cars, his stocks, and his pride. When he finished, he dropped the pen and put his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He was broken, stripped of the only thing that gave him identity, his money. I stood up. Marcus collected the papers and placed them back in the briefcase, securing the lock with a satisfying click. I looked down at the man who had once treated me like a wager. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar coin. It was the heavy kind used in casinos. I placed it gently on the metal table in front of his bowed head. The metal clinked sharply, ringing with finality. I told him that this was for the bus fare when he got out. I turned around and walked toward the heavy steel door. Marcus held it open for me. As I stepped into the hallway, I heard Carter whisper my name, a plea for mercy that came too late. I did not stop. I walked down the long corridor of the police station, my heels clicking a rhythm of victory. I had not just won the bet. I had bought the casino. The boardroom on the 51st floor of the Vanderwoodson Tower was cold enough to preserve a dead body. 20 men in expensive suits sat around the long mahogany table, shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs. The wolf pack was there. Liam, Mason, and Noah sat together near the end of the table. They looked nervous but hopeful. They believed that by turning state's witness against Carter, they had secured their positions in the company. They were waiting for the representative of Spade Capital, the mysterious private equity firm that had swallowed Carter's debt and equity in a single gulp this morning. I watched them from the security monitor in the hallway, adjusting the lapel of my black power suit. It was time to show them that a traitor is never rewarded by the new king. I pushed open the double-glass doors. My heels struck the polished granite floor with a sharp, authoritative rhythm that silenced the room instantly. I walked straight toward the head of the table. The chair that Carter had occupied for 10 years was empty, waiting for its new master. Mason stood up, his face twisting into a sneer of confusion. He asked what I was doing here. He told me that this was a closed meeting for board members and the new owners only. He gestured for security, telling them to escort the grieving ex-wife out of the building. I ignored him completely. I pulled out the heavy leather executive chair and sat down. I placed my clutch on the table, looking at each of them with a bored expression. I told Mason to sit down before he embarrassed himself further. Marcus stepped forward from behind me. He placed a single sheet of paper in front of each board member. It was the certificate of incorporation for Spade Capital. The name listed under sole proprietor was Elena van der Woodsen. The silence in the room shattered as the realization hit them like a physical blow. Liam picked up the paper. His hands shaking so hard the paper rattled against the table. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. He stammered that this was impossible. He said I was just a housewife who spent her days at the spa. I leaned back in the chair, spinning a pen between my fingers. I told them that while they were busy playing golf and making bets on women, I was running an algorithmic trading fund from my laptop in the guest bedroom. I told them that the $10 million they bet on my marriage was seed money for my first short position against their own company. I had been betting against them the entire time, and they never even saw the cards. I turned my gaze to the wolf pack. They looked small, shrinking into their suits like children caught stealing candy. I addressed them directly, my voice devoid of any warmth. I told them that Spade Capital had a strict policy regarding loyalty. I said that men who betray their best friend for a plea deal are liabilities that I cannot afford to keep on the payroll. I motioned to the security guards who were standing by the door. The same guards who used to open doors for these men. I ordered them to escort Mr. Paces, Liam, Mr. Mason, and Mr. Noah out of the building immediately. I told them to confiscate their company phones and laptops before they reached the elevator. I added that their severance packages had been denied due to gross misconduct, which meant they were leaving with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Mason tried to protest, shouting that I could not do this, that he knew where the bodies were buried. I laughed softly, a cold sound that cut through his bluster. I told him to go ahead and talk, because nobody listens to a broke, unemployed traitor. As the guards dragged them out of the room, Liam looked back at me one last time. He asked who I really was. He said Elena, the trophy wife, could not have done this. I smiled, reaching into my pocket. I pulled out a playing card and slid it across the long table until it stopped right in front of his empty seat. It was the Queen of Spades. I told him that he should have done his research. In the underground gambling dens of Macau, where I paid for my university degree, they didn't call me Elena. They called me the House. Because the house always wins. The doors closed behind them, leaving me alone with the remaining board members, who were now looking at me with terrified respect. They sat up straighter, fixing their ties, waiting for my command. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the skyline of New York City. The sun was setting, painting the city in shades of gold and blood. I had destroyed my husband, dismantled his inner circle, and seized his empire. The game was over. I tapped the table with my finger, bringing their attention back to me. I told them to open their binders to page 1. We had a lot of work to do to rebrand this company. The van der Woodsen name was dead. Long live the Queen. The penthouse was silent in a way that felt expensive. It was the silence of a vacuum where all the oxygen had been sucked out by lawyers and liquidation teams. I walked across the marble foyer for the last time. My heels clicked against the stone with a rhythm that sounded like a judge's gavel hitting the bench. I did not bring a suitcase. I did not come here to pack clothes or jewelry. Those things were just depreciation assets that belonged to the ghost of the woman who used to live here. I walked into the master bedroom and opened the nightstand drawer. I took out the only things that truly mattered. My passport, my original birth certificate, and an old deck of playing cards that I had bought for $2 at a gas station 10 years ago. These were the only things I owned when I walked into this marriage. And they were the only things I needed to walk out. Everything else in this apartment, the art, the furniture, the memories, was just collateral damage in a hostile takeover. I looked at the unmade bed where Carter used to sleep. It looked small and insignificant now. Just a piece of furniture in a portfolio of properties I intended to sell by the end of the week. The landline on the bedside table began to ring. It was a harsh, jarring sound that cut through the quiet. I knew who it was before I picked it up. Only one person would call this number now. I lifted the receiver and pressed it to my ear. An automated voice informed me that I had a collect call from the Metropolitan Detention Center. I accepted the charges. The line clicked and the sound of heavy breathing filled my ear. Carter's voice was unrecognizable. It was cracked and broken, stripped of all its arrogance. He did not scream or threaten this time. He begged. He pleaded with me to reconsider, asking if I remembered the good times we had in Paris, asking if I really wanted to see him rot in a cell with common criminals. He promised to sign anything, do anything, if I would just drop the charges and post his bail. He sounded like a child who had broken a vase and was terrified of the punishment. It was pathetic. And for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but then I remembered the bet. I remembered him laughing with his friends about buying me at a discount. I interrupted his sobbing with a voice as calm as a flatline. I told him that I did remember Paris. I remembered that he made me walk 3 blocks in the rain because he didn't want to get his new shoes wet. I told him that relationships are just like business deals. Carter, they require a return on investment. And for 3 years, you have been a liability that was dragging down my portfolio. I told him that the $10 million bet he made was actually the best financial advice he ever gave me. It taught me that everything has a price. Even love. I told him that I had calculated the final numbers this morning. After liquidating his assets, paying off his debts, and taking my 50% cut, the balance of his life was exactly 0. He started to scream again. A desperate, incoherent wail of a man falling into the abyss. I pulled the phone away from my ear. I looked at the receiver for a second. Then I gently placed it back on the cradle, severing the connection forever. The silence returned, heavier and sweeter than before. I walked back out to the living room. The panoramic window offered a view of the city I had just conquered. The lights of Manhattan twinkled below like a sea of diamonds. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the 10-carat engagement ring Carter had given me. It was heavy, ostentatious, and cold. I placed it on the glass coffee table next to the disconnect notice from the phone company. I didn't want it. I didn't need the money it would bring. Leaving it there was a message. It meant that I wasn't walking away with his money. I was walking away with my own. I turned my back on the view and walked to the private elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby. The doors slid shut smoothly, cutting off the view of the penthouse. As the elevator descended, I felt the weight of the last 3 years lifting off my shoulders, layer by layer, floor by floor. By the time the doors opened at the ground level, I felt weightless. Marcus was waiting for me outside by the curb, leaning against the door of a black sedan. He wasn't wearing his lawyer tie today. He looked relaxed, almost smiling. He opened the rear door for me. I slid into the leather seat, the scent of new car smell replacing the stale air of the penthouse. He got into the driver's seat and looked at me through the rearview mirror. He asked where I wanted to go. I looked out the window at the busy street. People rushing by, unaware that a queen was sitting among them. I thought about the private jet waiting on the tarmac at Teterboro, fueled and ready for a flight to Monaco. There was a high-stakes poker tournament starting there on Friday, and I felt lucky. I looked back at Marcus and gave him the first genuine smile I had worn in years. I told him to just drive. I told him that the world is a big place, and I have a lot of chips to cash in. The car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the flow of traffic. I watched the Vander Woodson Tower shrink in the distance behind me. It was just a building now, a monument to a dead name. I reached into my purse and pulled out the deck of cards. I shuffled them with one hand, the familiar snap of the cardstock soothing my nerves. I pulled out the top card and flipped it over. It was the Queen of Spades. I tucked it into the pocket of my blazer near my heart. The game was over. The house had won. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't playing by anyone else's rules. I closed my eyes and let the city lights wash over me, ready for the next hand.